I'm Sylvie Morland, 24 years old. Until 3 weeks ago, I believed family meant everything. Then my grandmother's funeral changed everything. I watched relatives I barely knew weep dramatically over her casket while I stood in the back, genuinely heartbroken. Grandma Elvira's words still echo in my mind. They'll never understand what we shared, little bird. What they didn't know was that I had been visiting her every Tuesday for 6 years, reading banned books and sharing secrets. The day after the funeral, I learned she'd left me everything, her house, her books, her entire estate. Not a penny to anyone else. But here's what makes this story unbelievable. The family that ignored her for years suddenly claimed I manipulated a lonely old woman. How do you fight people who write history to suit their greed? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The rain drummed against the cafe windows below my tiny studio apartment, a steady percussion that had become the soundtrack to my life in Portland. I'd been living above Grind Coffee for 8 months, hanging out with tips from my job at the used bookstore and whatever freelance editing work I could scrape together. The space wasn't much, barely 400 square feet with a Murphy bed. That's stuck halfway down in a kitchenette that required strategic maneuvering to avoid the leaky pipe under the sink, but it was mine, and that mattered more than I could explain to anyone who hadn't spent their childhood feeling like a perpetual guest in other people's spaces. My phone buzzed on the scarred wooden table I'd rescued from a sidewalk. The caller ID made my stomach drop. Riverside Memorial Home. I'd been dreading this call for months, ever since Grandma Elvira's last visit to the emergency room. Miss Morland? This is Janet from Riverside Memorial. I'm calling about your grandmother. Elvira Hawthorne. The words that followed felt like they were coming from underwater. Peaceful passing. Tuesday evening. Arrangements needed. I found myself nodding at the phone as if Janet could see me, my throat too tight to form actual words. Grandma Elvira was gone. I sat in my kitchen chair for what felt like hours after hanging. Watching the rain streak down the window and thinking about Tuesday afternoons. Every Tuesday for the past 6 years, since I turned 18 and moved to Portland, I'd taken the bus to her house in the Hawthorne district. We'd drink Earl Grey from our grandmother's china cups and talk about everything except what my mother wanted us to talk about. Mom had always insisted I visit Elvira out of duty. She's alone, she'd say with that particular edge that meant the conversation was over. It's the right thing to do. But Mom never understood that those Tuesday visits weren't charity. They were the highlight of my week. Elvira's house was everything my childhood had lacked. Shelves crammed with books that spilled their secrets in whispered conversations, afternoon light that painted the rooms gold, and a sense of permanence that felt like coming home. She'd greet me at the door with flour on her apron and questions about whatever I was reading, as if my opinions on Victorian literature were the most important thing in her day. Little Bird, she'd call me, a nickname that had started when I was 7 and discovered her collection of ornithology books. What storms have you weathered this week? Elvira never talked down to me, never treated me like I was too young to understand complexity. When I was struggling through community college, working 2 jobs to afford classes, she'd listen to my frustrations about professors who seemed determined to crush any original thought. When I decided to drop out and focus on working, she was the only family member who didn't lecture me about wasting my potential. Intelligence, she'd said, pouring tea with the precision of a ceremony, isn't measured by degrees. It's measured by curiosity, compassion, and the courage to think for yourself. I pulled out my phone to call my mother, though I dreaded the conversation. Mom and Elvira had what could charitably be called a complicated relationship. They spoke perhaps twice a year, conversations that lasted exactly long enough to exchange essential information and confirm that neither had died since the last call. Sylvie? Mom's voice was tired. She'd been pulling double shifts at the hospital for months, trying to pay off the medical bills from her own emergency surgery the previous year. Mom, I need to tell you something. Grandma Elvira passed away. Yesterday. The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When Mom finally spoke, her voice was carefully neutral. I see. Were you with her? No, I was supposed to visit today. She died Tuesday evening. The words felt wrong in my mouth, too final. I'll call Caleb, Mom said, referring to my uncle, Elvira's oldest son. He'll want to handle the arrangements. I almost laughed at that. Uncle Caleb, who lived in a minimalist downtown condo and hadn't spoken to Elvira in over 2 years after. She'd refused to let him sell her house during one of his financial rough patches. But Caleb had always been the family's designated decision-maker, the one who swept in during crises with his architectural precision and expensive suits. Actually, Mom, I think there might already be arrangements. Elvira mentioned having everything planned out. Another pause. Of course she did. Your grandmother never left anything to chance. There was something in Mom's tone I couldn't quite identify: resignation, maybe, or old frustration. Mom had always been the responsible one, the daughter who called when she remembered to, who sent birthday cards and Christmas gifts, who did her duty without complaint but also without joy. I never understood why she and Elvira seemed to circle each other at such a careful distance. After we hung up, I found myself pulling on my rain jacket and walking the 12 blocks to Elvira's house. I didn't have keys, couldn't get inside, but I needed to be near the place where she'd shared so many secrets with me. The house stood on a corner lot, a 1920s craftsman bungalow, with a front porch that wrapped around 2 sides, and windows that seemed to glow even when they were dark. Elvira had painted it sage green with cream trim the year before, ignoring Caleb's suggestions about improving resale value with neutral colors. I'm not planning to sell, she told me that Tuesday when I found her on the porch steps with paint samples spread around her like a paper rainbow. This house will outlive me, and whoever comes after should know it was loved. Standing on the sidewalk in the rain, I could see the yellow roses she planted along the fence, the ones she'd named after characters in Jane Austen novels. Elizabeth and Jane and Catherine, blooming defiantly in the Oregon drizzle. The sight of them made my chest tight with loss. A car pulled into the driveway, and I recognized the sleek lines of Caleb's BMW. He climbed out wearing a black wool coat that probably cost more than my monthly rent, his silver hair perfectly styled despite the weather. When he saw me standing on the sidewalk, his expression shifted into the polite mask he wore for family obligations. Sylvie, I didn't expect to see you here. I just wanted to see the house, I said, feeling suddenly foolish for standing in the rain like some kind of Gothic heroine. Caleb pulled a key from his pocket. Where had he gotten a key? And unlocked the front door. I need to do a preliminary assessment of the property. You're welcome to come in, I suppose. I followed him into the entryway where the familiar smell of lavender and old books wrapped around me like a hug. Everything was exactly as I'd left it the previous Tuesday. Elvira's reading glasses folded on the side. Table next to her chair, a half-finished crossword puzzle on the coffee table, and the latest library books stacked on the mantelpiece. Caleb was already walking through the rooms with the clinical efficiency of someone conducting an appraisal. He paused at the built-in bookshelves that lined the living room walls, running his finger along the spines with the sort of calculation that made my skin crawl. Some of these might be worth something, he murmured, more to himself than to me. First editions, signed copies. Mother always did have expensive taste in books. I watched him examine the room where Elvira and I had spent countless hours discussing everything from poetry to politics, where she'd introduced me to authors who changed how I saw the world, where she'd listened to my dreams and fears with. The kind of attention that made me feel like my thoughts mattered. There will be quite a lot to sort through, Caleb continued, opening the desk drawers and shuffling through papers. I assume she left some kind of will, though knowing Mother, she probably made it unnecessarily complicated. She mentioned having everything organized, I said carefully. Caleb glanced at me with a look I couldn't quite read. Yes, well, we'll see what her idea of organized looks like. She was always secretive about her affairs. I bit back the urge to defend her. Elvira wasn't secretive. She was private. There was a difference between hiding things and simply choosing not to share everything with people who wouldn't understand or appreciate the sharing. We were interrupted by the doorbell. Caleb opened it to reveal a woman in her 70s with steel gray hair and eyes the color of storm clouds. I recognized her immediately from the photographs on Elvira's mantelpiece. Frida Mahoney, Elvira's oldest friend and the executor of her estate. Caleb, Frida said with the kind of polite coolness that suggested their relationship was purely functional. And Sylvie, dear. Her voice warmed considerably when she looked at me. I'm so sorry for your loss. Your grandmother spoke of you. Often. Frida carried a leather briefcase and wore an expression that suggested she had important business to conduct. I need to meet with the family regarding Elvira's will. Is Mirren coming? I haven't reached her yet, Caleb said, though. I was fairly certain he hadn't tried. Perhaps we could handle the preliminary details first. Frida shook her head. Elvira was very specific about how this should be handled. All beneficiaries need to be present for the reading of the will. Something in her tone made my stomach flutter with an emotion I couldn't identify. It wasn't quite anxiety, but it wasn't comfort either. Beneficiaries? Caleb's voice had taken on the sharp edge it got when he was trying to control a situation that wasn't cooperating with his plans. Yes, the will names specific beneficiaries, who need to be present when it's read. That includes Sylvie. I felt my eyebrows rise. Me? Frida's smile was gentle but somehow secretive. Oh yes, dear. You're very much included in your grandmother's final wishes. Caleb's expression had shifted into something I'd rarely seen from him, uncertainty. Uncle Caleb was accustomed to being the one who managed family crises, who made decisions and informed everyone else of the outcomes. The idea that Elvira might have made arrangements he wasn't aware of clearly unsettled him. I'll need to coordinate with everyone's schedules, he said, pulling out his phone. When would be convenient for this reading? Tomorrow afternoon at 2:00, Frida said without consulting any calendar. Here at the house. Elvira specifically requested that the will be read in her living room. After Frida left and Caleb locked up the house again, I walked home through the rain feeling like I was carrying a secret I didn't understand. The idea that Elvira had included me in her will was surprising, but not shocking. She'd always been. Generous with gifts, books she thought I'd enjoy, small amounts of money when she knew I was struggling with bills. But something about Frida's manner suggested this was more significant than a keepsake or a small inheritance. Back in my apartment, I made tea in the chipped mug Elvira had given me for my 21st birthday, hand-painted with tiny birds. And the words, "For my little bird, who was always meant to fly." I sat by the window watching the city lights blur through the rain and tried to imagine what tomorrow might bring. The next morning, I woke to 17 missed calls and twice as many text messages. Word had spread through the family that Elvira's will was being read, and suddenly Everyone was very concerned about my well-being and very interested in reconnecting. My cousin Jessica, who hadn't spoken to me since high school graduation, left a voicemail asking if I wanted to grab coffee and catch up. My Aunt Diane sent a long text message about family bonds and how we all need to stick together during difficult times. Even my cousin Marcus, who lived in Seattle and worked in tech, sent a message expressing his condolences and suggesting we should stay in touch more often. The sudden attention made my skin crawl. Where had all this family concern been when I was working 3 jobs to afford community college? Where were the phone calls when I was eating ramen for every meal because I couldn't afford groceries? The timing felt less like genuine care and more like strategic positioning. I arrived at Elvira's house at 1:45, early enough to have a few minutes alone with my memories before the circus began. The roses looked particularly vibrant in the afternoon light, and I could almost hear Elvira's voice explaining the difference between Elizabeth and Jane's blooming patterns. Caleb arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, followed by my mother, who looked tired and slightly confused about why she'd been summoned. Then came the cousins Jessica with her perfectly styled hair and designer purse, Marcus looking uncomfortable in a suit that suggested he'd driven down from Seattle that morning, and Diane's children, who I barely knew but who had apparently cleared their schedules for the occasion. The living room felt too small for so many people, especially people who rarely spent time together and had no idea how to navigate being in the same space. Everyone perched on furniture that wasn't meant for formal gatherings, holding teacups that Frida had thoughtfully prepared, and making the kind of stilted conversation that happens when strangers are pretending to be family. Frida entered carrying a manila envelope that seemed to command everyone's attention. She settled into Elvira's favorite armchair, the burgundy velvet one, where I curled up beside her countless Tuesday afternoons and looked around the room with an expression that suggested she was measuring everyone present. Before I read Elvira's will, she began, I want you all to know that she spent considerable time crafting these wishes. Every decision was made with care and intention. She asked me to remind you that her choices reflect her values and her assessment of who would best honor her legacy. The room fell completely silent. I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking, marking seconds that felt loaded with possibility and dread. Frida opened the envelope and withdrew. Several pages of cream-colored paper covered in Elvira's distinctive handwriting. The last will and testament of Elvira Rose Hawthorne, she read, and then paused to look around the room again. I, Elvira Rose Hawthorne, being of sound mind and clear intention, hereby bequeath my worldly possessions to those who have shown love without expectation, loyalty without obligation, and understanding without judgment. Another pause. I noticed Caleb's jaw tightening slightly. To my son Caleb, who has built a successful career and requires no assistance from me, I leave my collection of architectural books and my grandmother's silver tea service in acknowledgement of his achievements and his appreciation for fine craftsmanship. Caleb's expression didn't change, but I saw his hands clench slightly in his lap. To my daughter Mirren, who has worked tirelessly to build an independent life, I leave my jewelry collection and my mother's china in recognition of her strength and self-reliance. Mom nodded slightly, though she looked more confused than pleased. To my grandchildren Jessica, Marcus, and the others who have pursued their own paths, I leave a remembrance of $500 each, with my hopes for their continued success and happiness. Jessica's face went through several expressions, very quickly surprise, calculation, and what looked like indignation. And to my granddaughter Sylvie Morland, who has shown me that love is not measured by blood or obligation, but by presence, attention, and genuine care, I leave the remainder of my estate. The silence that followed was deafening. Frida continued reading, but I stopped hearing the words, the remainder of her estate. The house, the books, the savings accounts I'd never known existed. Everything that wasn't specifically mentioned in the smaller bequests was coming to me. I felt like the room was spinning slightly, or maybe I was the one spinning while the room stayed still. This couldn't be right. Yes, Elvira and I were close, but surely she wouldn't have left me everything. Surely she wouldn't have excluded her own children and grandchildren in favor of the one person who was already closest to her. But as Frida continued reading the specifics, the house and all its contents, the investment accounts, the savings accounts, even the small life insurance policy, it became clear that this wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. This was exactly what Elvira had intended. When Frida finished reading, the silence stretched until it became uncomfortable. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, but I couldn't bring myself to look up from my hands. Finally, Caleb spoke. "There must be some mistake." "No mistake," Frida said firmly. "I helped Elvira draft this will myself. She was very clear about her intentions. But this is..." Jessica's voice trailed off as if she couldn't find words for what this was. "Unexpected," Mom said quietly. "It's insane," Caleb said, standing up with the kind of controlled energy that suggested he was working very hard not to explode. Mother was 83 years old. She was isolated, lonely, vulnerable to manipulation. "She was nothing of the sort," Frida snapped, and for the first time, her composure cracked slightly. Elvira was sharp as a tack until the day she died. She knew exactly what she was doing. Did she? Caleb turned to look at me, and his expression was hard in a way that made my stomach drop. Or did someone spend 6 years convincing a lonely old woman that she was loved and appreciated, building up to exactly this moment? The accusation hit me like a physical blow. That's not what happened, isn't it? You were the only one who visited her regularly. You were the only one she talked to about personal matters. You had unlimited access to someone who became increasingly isolated from the rest of her family. She wasn't isolated, I said, finding my voice even though it came out shakier than I'd intended. She chose not to spend time with people who only called when they needed something. "That's enough," Mom said, but her voice lacked conviction. Caleb ignored her. "How much did you know about this will, Sylvie? How long have you been planning for this windfall?" "I had no idea," I said, standing up because I couldn't bear to have him looming over me. "I'm as surprised as anyone." "Are you?" "Because this seems like a very convenient surprise for someone who's been struggling financially for years." The room erupted in murmurs and uncomfortable shifting. I realized that everyone was looking at me with expressions ranging from suspicion to outright hostility. Even Mom seemed uncertain, as if she was trying to figure out whether her own daughter was capable of the kind of manipulation Caleb was suggesting. "I never asked her for anything," I said, my voice getting stronger. "I visited because I loved her. Because she was interesting and kind and treated me like my thoughts mattered. I didn't know about any inheritance." "Of course you didn't," Jessica said with the kind of fake sweetness that was worse than open hostility. "You just happened to be the only grandchild who made time for her." "You could have made time for her too," I shot back. "She would have loved to hear from any of you. She used to ask about everyone, wonder how you were doing, whether you were happy." "Don't," Caleb said sharply. "Don't try to make this about our relationships with her. This is about a vulnerable elderly woman being taken advantage of by someone who saw an opportunity." I felt tears starting to burn behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Not here, not in front of people who had already decided I was guilty of something I'd never even considered. I'm going to contest this will, Caleb announced to the room. I'll be consulting with my attorney about having it overturned on the grounds of undue influence and elder abuse. Elder abuse? The words came out louder than I'd intended. I never abused her. I loved her. Love can be a form of manipulation, Caleb said coldly, especially when it comes with an agenda. I looked around the room, hoping to find an ally, someone who might defend me or at least question Caleb's assumptions. But everyone was carefully avoiding my eyes. Even Mom seemed to be studying her hands with intense concentration. I think, Frida said into the silence, that everyone needs time to process this information. Sylvie, the will is legal and properly executed. The estate transfer will proceed as Elvira intended. If anyone wishes to contest it, that's their right, but they'll need to provide evidence of their claims. After everyone left, I sat alone in Elvira's living room, holding the copy of the will that Frida had given me. The afternoon light was fading, and the house felt both familiar and foreign, like a place I'd visited in a dream. I kept reading the same lines over and over to my granddaughter Sylvie Morland, who has shown me that love is not measured by blood or obligation, but by presence, attention, and genuine care. I leave the remainder of my estate. Had I really shown her love without obligation? I tried to examine my own motives, to be honest about why I visited every Tuesday for 6 years. Had there been some part of me that hoped for this outcome? Some unconscious calculation that spending time with a lonely old woman might eventually pay off? But as I sat in the chair where Elvira used to tell me stories about her childhood, where she'd taught me to knit and introduced me to poets I'd never heard of, where she'd listened to my fears about the future without trying to fix them, I knew that wasn't true. I'd visited because those Tuesday afternoons were the best part of my week. Because Elvira made me feel seen and understood in a way that no one else ever had. The house around me felt like a museum of our relationship. Every surface held memories, the kitchen table where we'd played Scrabble, and she'd let me use words from other languages. The window seat where she'd read me poetry while I sketched the birds in her garden. The shelf where she kept the books. She'd special ordered because I'd mentioned wanting to read them, but now those memories felt tainted by my family's accusations. Had I unconsciously manipulated her? Had my presence been a form of emotional coercion that had influenced her decisions? The questions made me feel sick. Because I couldn't be completely certain of the answers, my phone buzzed with a text from Cass. My housemate. Haven't seen you all day. Everything okay? I typed back. Grandmother's will was read today. She left me everything. Family thinks I manipulated her. Hiding at her house. His response came immediately. Holy shit. I'm bringing food and wine. Don't move. 20 minutes. Later, Cass knocked on the front door carrying takeout bags and a bottle of cheap red wine. He took one look at my face and wrapped me in a hug that smelled like coffee and the lavender detergent he used, because regular detergent gave him hives. Tell me everything, he said, settling beside me on the couch and unpacking what appeared to be enough Thai food for 4 people. I told him about the will, about Caleb's accusations, about the way everyone had looked at me like I was a stranger they were just meeting for the first time. Cass listened without interrupting, occasionally making indignant noises or shaking his head. So let me get this straight, he said when I finished. Your grandmother left you her estate because you were the only person who consistently spent time with her and treated her like a human being instead of an obligation. And your family's response is to accuse you of elder abuse. Maybe they're right, I said quietly. Maybe I did influence her without meaning to. Bullshit. Cass's voice was sharp with anger. You know what elder abuse looks like? It looks like isolating someone from their support systems, controlling their finances, making them feel dependent and afraid. It doesn't look like visiting every week to drink tea and talk about books. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But what if, no what ifs, you loved her. She loved you. She made a decision about how to distribute her property, and she had every right to make that decision. The fact that your family is pissed off doesn't make her choice invalid. I wanted to believe him, but the doubt felt like it had taken root in my chest and was growing with every breath. Caleb's going to contest the will. He'll hire lawyers. Drag this out in court. Make me prove that I didn't manipulate her. Then you'll fight back. You'll get your own lawyer and defend yourself. With what money? I can barely afford rent. Cass was quiet for a moment, twirling pad thai around his fork. What did she actually leave you? I mean, specifically. I pulled out the will and read him the relevant section. The house. The contents of the house. The savings accounts. The investment accounts. The life insurance policy. Okay, so you're not broke anymore. You can afford a lawyer. The simple logic of that statement hit me like revelation. I wasn't the broke 24-year-old who'd woken up that morning. I was now the owner of a house in one of Portland's most desirable neighborhoods, plus whatever financial assets Elvira had accumulated over her 83 years. I don't even know how much money we're talking about, I admitted. Frida has all the account information. I haven't seen any of the actual numbers. Well, that's step one. Figure out what you're dealing with, then decide how hard you want to. Fight for it. After Cass left, I walked through the house again, this time trying to see it through different eyes. What was I actually inheriting? The house itself was probably worth at least $600,000, maybe more in the current market. The books, I never really thought about their value, but Caleb's comment about first editions and signed copies suggested they might be worth more than I'd realized. Pulled a few volumes from the shelves, looking for anything that might indicate their value. A signed first edition of To Kill a Mockingbird, a pristine copy of The Feminine Mistake with what looked like Betty Friedan's signature, a collection of Virginia Woolf that appeared to be complete and in remarkable condition. These weren't just books. They were investments. Elvira had been quietly building a collection of significant literary works for decades, and I'd spent years reading them without understanding their worth. In the kitchen, I found the folder where Elvira kept her important documents, bank statements, investment reports, insurance paperwork. The numbers made me sit down hard in one of the kitchen chairs. Elvira had been wealthy. Not rich, exactly, but comfortable in a way that must have taken decades of careful saving and investing. The savings accounts alone contained more money than I made in the past 3 years combined. The investment accounts were even more substantial. I was inheriting close to $2 million in total assets. The realization made me feel dizzy and slightly nauseous. This wasn't a small legacy or a sentimental gesture. This was a life-changing amount of money, the kind of inheritance that people absolutely would fight over in court. No wonder Caleb was furious. No wonder Jessica looked like she'd been slapped. No wonder Mom seemed confused and suspicious. From their perspective, Elvira had given away a fortune to someone who wasn't even her direct descendant. But from my perspective, sitting in the kitchen where Elvira and I had shared hundreds of cups of tea, the money felt almost secondary to the real inheritance, the trust she placed in me, the responsibility she'd given me to continue whatever legacy she'd been building. I found a leather journal tucked between the bank statements, filled with Elvira's careful handwriting. The entries went back years, documenting not just daily events, but her thoughts about family, relationships, and the future. March 15th, 2019, Sylvie came by today, upset about her professor's dismissive attitude toward her essay on feminist themes in Victorian literature. I told her about my own experiences trying to discuss dangerous ideas as a young librarian. She listened with the kind of attention that most people reserve for entertainment. I'm reminded again why I prefer a company to that of my own. Children, July 2nd, 2020, called Caleb to check in. He spent 15 minutes telling me about his latest project and 3 minutes, asking about my health before excusing himself for a conference call. Sometimes I wonder if he's capable of having a conversation that isn't fundamentally about himself. November 10th, 2021. Sylvie brought me soup when I had that terrible flu. She sat with me for 4 hours, reading aloud from Persuasion and making sure I was drinking enough fluids. When I tried to thank her, she seemed genuinely confused about why I would thank her for just being a decent human being. If only the rest of my family understood that being decent requires effort. Page after page of observations, reflections, and what felt like evidence that Elvira's decision hadn't been impulsive or influenced by manipulation. She'd been watching all of us for years, measuring our actions against our words, our presence against our absence. February 14th, 2023. Had lunch with Frida and mentioned my concern about what will happen to my books after I'm gone. Frida asked about leaving them to the library, but I can't bear the thought of the collection being broken up and scattered. Sylvie would understand the importance of keeping them together. She's the only one who's ever really appreciated what I've built here. June 8th, 2023. Caleb called asking if I considered selling the house and moving into senior living. He's worried about me being alone in such a large space. What he means is that he's worried about property values and inheritance taxes. He doesn't understand that this house isn't just real estate, it's the repository of everything I've learned and loved and chosen to preserve. September 12th, 2023. Sylvie's mother seems to think these visits are charity work, something Sylvie does out of obligation. She has no idea that Sylvie and I have real conversations about books and ideas and the future. She doesn't know that Sylvie is the only person who asks my opinion because she actually wants to hear the answer. The journal painted a picture of someone who had been carefully observing family dynamics for years and making decisions based on those observations. This wasn't the impulsive choice of an isolated elderly woman. This was the deliberate decision of someone who had been paying attention. I closed the journal and sat in the growing darkness, thinking about what Caleb had said about undue influence. Had I influenced Elvira? Absolutely. But not through manipulation or calculation. I influenced her by showing up consistently, by listening to her stories, by treating her like her thoughts and experiences mattered. And she had influenced me too, teaching me about literature and history, showing me what it looked like too. Live according to your values even when it was inconvenient, demonstrating that it was possible to age with grace and curiosity and fierce independence. That felt like a fair exchange. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. The caller ID showed Frida's number. Sylvie, dear, I hope you're all right. I know today was difficult. I'm still processing everything, I admitted. I imagine so. I wanted to let you know that I'll be handling the estate transfer paperwork. But there are some things you should know right away. Elvira set up automatic payments for all the house expenses, utilities, insurance, property taxes. Everything will continue as normal while we work through the legal requirements. How long will that take? Under normal circumstances, a few months. But if your uncle proceeds with contesting the will, it could take much longer. I took a deep breath. Frida, can I ask you something? Do you think I manipulated her? Do you think I somehow influenced her decision? Frida was quiet for a long moment. Sylvie, I knew Elvira for over 60 years. I watched her raise her children, build her career, navigate her relationships. She was one of the most independent, strong-willed people I've ever known. The idea that anyone could manipulate her into making a decision this significant is frankly insulting to her memory. But did you spend time with her? Yes. Did you care? About her? Obviously. Did she respond to that care by including you in her legacy? Absolutely. That's not manipulation. That's how relationships work. You invest in people, and sometimes they invest back in you. After we hung up, I found myself thinking about investment and return, about the economics of love and attention. Had my relationship with Elvira been transactional? Had I unconsciously been building towards some kind of payoff? But as I sat in her living room surrounded by books she'd pressed into my hands over the years, furniture she'd let me curl up on while I read, windows she pointed through while telling me stories about the neighborhood's history, I knew that wasn't true. The payoff had been the relationship itself, the feeling of being understood and valued, the education she'd given me about literature and life, the sense of belonging I'd found in her presence. The inheritance was overwhelming, but it wasn't. Why? I loved her. The next morning, I woke up in my own apartment feeling like I was living in someone else's life. Everything looked the same, the Murphy bed that stuck, the leaky pipe, the rain streaking down the windows, but everything felt different. I owned a house now. I had money in bank accounts I never opened. I was the target of a lawsuit from my own family. I also had 17 more missed calls and 43 new text messages. Word had spread beyond the immediate family. Cousins I hadn't heard from in years were reaching out with condolences and questions. Family friends were offering support and asking about memorial services. A few of the messages felt genuine, but most had an undertone of curiosity that made my skin crawl. The worst was a voicemail from my cousin Derek, Caleb's son, who lived in California and worked in real estate development. His message was friendly and casual, but the content made my stomach turn. Hey, Sylvie, heard about Grandma Elvira. So sorry for your loss. I know you two were close. Listen, I'm going to be in Portland next week for work, and I was thinking we should grab dinner. It's been way too long since we've caught up, and I'd love to hear how you're doing. Also, I know inheriting property can be really overwhelming, especially for someone your age. If you want any advice about managing real estate assets, or if you're thinking about selling, I'd be happy to help you navigate the process. Family discount, of course. Call me back. The transparent attempt to position himself as helpful while clearly angling for a piece of the inheritance made me feel sick. Derek had never called me before, never expressed any interest in my life or well-being. But now that I was potentially worth millions, suddenly we needed to catch up. I deleted the voicemail without calling him back. Cass found me sitting at the kitchen table staring at my phone and looking, according to him, like someone who's been kicked by a horse. More family outreach? He asked, pouring coffee into 2 mugs and settling across from me. 17 calls, 43 texts, 3 offers to help me manage the inheritance, 2 invitations to catch up over dinner, 1 cousin offering to buy the house from me for what he calls a fair price, so I don't have to deal with the burden of property ownership. Jesus Christ. These people have no shame. The worst part is that they're all being so nice about it, so concerned about my well-being. so worried that I might be overwhelmed by such a big responsibility. Cass snorted. Yeah, they're really worried about you. Worried you might actually keep what your grandmother left you. Maybe I should sell the house, I said, voicing the thought that had been circling in my head since Derek's voicemail. Take the money and disappear somewhere they can't find me. Is that what you want to do? I thought about the question seriously. Did I want to sell Elvira's house? Did I want to liquidate her book collection and her carefully chosen furniture and her grandmother's china? Did I want to turn everything she'd preserved into cash and start over somewhere else? No, I said finally. I want to live in that house and take care of those books and drink tea from her grandmother's cups. I want to continue whatever she was building there, then do that. But what if Caleb's right? What if I did manipulate her somehow? What if I don't deserve this? Cass reached across the table and took my hands. Listen to me. Your grandmother was an intelligent, educated woman who lived independently until the day she died. She made a choice about how to distribute her assets, and she had every legal and moral right to make that choice. The fact that her choice benefits you doesn't make it invalid, but no buts. You didn't manipulate her, you loved her. She loved you back. She decided to leave you her legacy because she trusted you to honor it. Stop letting other people make you doubt what you know is true. That afternoon, I met with Frida at her law office to go over the practical details of the inheritance. The office was exactly what I'd expected: books everywhere, comfortable furniture that looked like it had been collected over decades, and walls covered with photographs of Frida with various groups of people at what appeared to be political rallies and community events. Elvira and I met at a civil rights protest in 1963, Frida said, noticing me looking at the photographs. We were both arrested for disturbing the peace. Spent 8 hours in jail together talking about books and social justice. Been friends ever since. She spread the estate documents across her desk, walking me through bank accounts and investment portfolios with the patience of someone who understood that financial complexity could be overwhelming. The house is worth approximately $750,000 in the current market, she said. The investment accounts total just over $800,000. The savings accounts add another $350,000. The life insurance policy will pay out $200,000. And then there are the books. What about the books? Elvira spent 40 years building that collection. I helped her track down some of the rarer items. Conservative estimate puts the collection's value at around $200,000, but some individual pieces might be worth much more. I stared at the numbers on the papers in front of me. Even conservative estimates put the total inheritance at over $2 million. This is insane, I said quietly. It's the result of a lifetime of careful planning and investing. Elvira lived modestly, saved consistently, and made smart decisions about money. She wanted to leave something meaningful behind. But why me? Why not her children? Why not split it among all the grandchildren? Frida leaned back in her chair, studying me with eyes that seemed to see more than I was comfortable revealing. May I ask you something, Sylvie? In all the time you spent with Elvira, did she ever seem like someone who made impulsive decisions? No, she thought everything through. Sometimes she'd spend weeks deciding whether to replace a lamp. Exactly. This wasn't an impulsive decision. She thought about it for years, considered various options, and ultimately chose the path that felt right to her. But what about family loyalty? What about blood being thicker than water? What about love being thicker than blood? Frida countered. Elvira used to say that family isn't just about who you're related to. It's about who shows up for you, who pays attention to you, who treats you like you matter. By that definition, you were more family to her than her own children. The meeting lasted 3 hours, covering everything from tax implications to property maintenance. By the end, I had a folder full of documents and a head spinning with information about my new responsibilities. One more thing, Frida said as I was getting ready to leave. Elvira left you something else. Something she wanted you to have immediately. She pulled a small wooden box from her desk drawer and handed it to me. Inside was a key attached to a silver chain, along with a note in Elvira's handwriting. Little bird. This key opens the safe deposit box at First National Bank. Inside, you'll find some things I've been saving for you, including letters I wrote but never sent. I hope they help you understand why I made the choices I did. Trust yourself and don't let anyone convince you that love is something to be ashamed of. That evening, I sat in Elvira's living room, holding the key and thinking about secrets. What had she been saving for me? What letters had she written but never sent? And why did she think I might need help understanding her choices? The house felt different now that I knew it was mine. The creaking floorboards and settling sounds that had always seemed like the house's way of talking to itself now felt like communication directed at me. I was the new guardian of this space, responsible for the books and furniture and memories it contained. I called my mother. Sylvie, is everything all right? I wanted to talk to you about the inheritance, about what Caleb said yesterday. Mom! Was quiet for a long moment. What did you want to say? I want you to know that I never asked her for anything. I never even thought about inheritance. I visited because I enjoyed her company. I know, Mom said quietly. Do you? Because yesterday, you seemed like you weren't sure. Another pause. Sylvie, your relationship with your grandmother was something I never understood. You two had a connection that I never had with her, even though she was my mother. Sometimes that was hard to watch. Hard how? She was never warm with me. Even when I was a child, she was polite but distant, loving in her way, but not affectionate. But with you, she was different. More open, more generous with her attention. I tried to imagine my mother as a child, trying to connect with Elvira and being met with politeness instead of warmth. It made me sad for both of them. Maybe you were too much alike, I suggested. Maybe you were both too independent to know how to be vulnerable with each other. Maybe, but watching her with you, seeing how much she enjoyed your visits, sometimes I felt jealous of my own daughter. And that's not fair to either of you. Do you think I manipulated her? No, I think you loved her in a way that she needed. To be loved, and she responded to that. I think Caleb is angry and looking for someone to blame for his own regrets about his relationship with her. The relief I felt at hearing those words almost made me cry. Thank you for saying that. I should have said it yesterday. I should have defended you instead of sitting there like a coward. I'm sorry. After we hung up, I felt lighter, as if something I'd been carrying had been set down. If Mom believed that I hadn't manipulated Elvira, then maybe I could stop questioning my own motivations. The next morning, I went to First National Bank to open the safe deposit box. The process required paperwork and identification, but Frida had prepared me for that. The bank manager, a woman named Patricia, who appeared to be around Elvira's age, remembered her well. Mrs. Hawthorne was a lovely woman, she said as she led me to the safe deposit box room. Very organized, very precise about her banking. She mentioned you several times over the years, always spoke of you with such pride. The safe deposit box was larger than I'd expected, and it was packed with items that seemed to tell the story of Elvira's entire life. There were old photographs, birth certificates, marriage licenses, and stacks of letters tied with ribbon. But the most striking items were 3 manila envelopes labeled with my name in Elvira's handwriting. Each envelope was dated, one from 2 years ago, one from last year, and one from just 6 months ago. I took everything back to Elvira's house and spread it across the dining room table. The photograph showed a woman I'd never seen before. Young Elvira at protests and political rallies, graduation ceremonies, and quiet moments with friends. She looked fierce and determined. Nothing like the gentle grandmother I'd known. The letters told a story I'd never heard before. Elvira had been more politically active than she'd ever let on, involved in civil rights work and women's liberation movements. She donated money to causes I'd never heard her mention, volunteered for organizations I didn't know she'd supported, but the most revealing documents were her own letters, dozens of them, written to family members but never sent. Letters to Caleb explaining why she couldn't support his lifestyle and values. Letters to Jessica trying to understand why they'd grown so distant. Letters to my mother attempting to bridge the gap between them, and letters to me written over the past 3 years that read like a record of our relationship from her perspective. Dear Sylvie, today you brought me that book of poetry by Mary Oliver, and we spent 2 hours discussing what it means to live deliberately. I've been thinking about that phrase all evening. So few people live deliberately. Most people simply react to circumstances, letting life happen to them instead of making conscious choices about what they value and how they want to spend their time. But you've always been different. Even at 21, you seem to understand that attention is a form of love, that presence is a gift you can choose to give or withhold. I hope you never lose that understanding, dear Sylvie. You asked me today why I never remarried after your grandfather died. I told you that I'd never found anyone who improved my solitude, but that wasn't the complete truth. The complete truth is that I learned to value my independence more than companionship, to trust my own judgment more than consensus. I've spent 40 years building a life that reflects my values rather than other people's expectations. I hope that when you're my age, you'll be able to say the same, dear Sylvie. I've been thinking about legacy lately, about what we leave behind when we're gone. Most people focus on money or property, but I think the real legacy is influence. The way we shape other people's understanding of what's possible, what's valuable, what's worth preserving. You've given me the gift of knowing that at least one person understands what I've been trying to build here. That makes all the difference. The final envelope contained the most recent letter, dated just 3 months before Elvira's death. Asterisk. Dear Sylvie, I've decided to leave you everything. Not because you need it, though I know you could use the financial security, and not because the others don't deserve it, though some of them don't, but because I trust you to understand what I've been building and to continue it in your own way. This house isn't just real estate, it's a repository of ideas, books, conversations, and careful choices. The money isn't just savings, it's the product of a lifetime of living below my means so that I could have the freedom to support causes I believed in and people I loved. I'm giving this to you because I believe you'll use it well, not because I expect you to use it exactly as I would. Trust your judgment. Follow your values. Don't let anyone make you feel guilty for being chosen. Reading that letter, I finally understood something that had been bothering me since the will reading. This wasn't about me being the favorite grandchild or about Elvira trying to punish the rest of the family. This was about her belief that I would continue whatever work she'd been doing, whatever legacy she'd been building. But what exactly had she been building? What was her real legacy beyond the house and the books and the investment accounts? I spent the next several hours going through her papers more carefully, looking for patterns and connections. What I found was the record of a woman who had, quietly, supported dozens of causes over the decades: literacy programs, women's shelters, civil rights organizations, environmental groups. She'd been making regular donations, volunteering time, serving on boards, all while maintaining the public persona of a mild-mannered retired librarian. The financial records showed payments to organizations I'd never heard of, scholarships she'd funded for students who couldn't afford college, anonymous donations to families in crisis. She'd been using her modest wealth to make a significant impact, but she'd done it so quietly that even her own family hadn't known. This was her real legacy, not just the money, but the template she created for using resources to support values. She'd left me everything, not so I could buy a big house and expensive cars, but so I could continue the work she'd been doing. The realization was both thrilling and terrifying. I'd inherited not just wealth, but responsibility. Not just assets, but a mission. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but when I answered, the voice was familiar. Sylvie? This is Jessica. I was wondering if we could meet for coffee. I think we need to talk. I almost hung up. After 2 days of fielding calls from relatives who suddenly wanted to catch up, I wasn't interested in any more strategic conversations. But something in Jessica's tone was different from the others, less calculated, more uncertain. What did you want to talk about? About what happened yesterday? About the will? About things I should have said a long time ago. We met at a coffee shop in the Pearl District, far enough from both our neighborhoods that we were unlikely to run into anyone we knew. Jessica looked tired, less polished than she had at the will reading. She'd always been the family member most concerned with appearances, but today she looked like someone who'd spent the night thinking about uncomfortable truths. I owe you an apology, she said before I'd even sat down. For yesterday. For the way I acted when we heard about the inheritance. I waited for the but that usually followed apologies like this. I was shocked and angry, and I took it out on you. That wasn't fair. And now? Jessica stirred her coffee, avoiding my eyes. Now I've had time to think about it. To really think about my relationship with Grandma Elvira and yours. What did you conclude? That I was jealous. That I've been jealous for years of the relationship you two had. And that my jealousy made me look for someone to blame instead of looking at my own choices. This wasn't what I'd expected. I'd been prepared for more accusations, more attempts to convince me to share the inheritance or sell the house. I hadn't been prepared for honesty. When we were kids, Jessica continued, I used to love visiting Grandma Elvira's house. She had all those books, and she'd let me explore them, ask questions, stay up late looking at the pictures. But somewhere along the way, I started thinking her interests were boring, old-fashioned, not relevant to my life. What changed? I got older and decided that caring about books and ideas wasn't cool. I wanted to focus on clothes and boys and popularity, and Grandma Elvira. She didn't know how to connect with that version of me. Jessica's eyes filled with tears. I spent so many years thinking she was stuffy and out of touch. I stopped asking her about her books, stopped listening when she tried to tell me about history or literature. I treated her like she was the sweet old lady whose interests were quaint but irrelevant. She never stopped caring about you, I said gently. She used to ask about you all the time. Wonder how you were doing, whether you were happy. I know. And that makes it worse. She kept reaching out and I kept pulling away, and now it's too late to fix it. We sat in silence for a few minutes, both of us thinking about missed opportunities and relationships that had been allowed to atrophy through neglect. I'm not going to contest the will, Jessica said finally. I wanted you to know that. Dad can do whatever he wants, but I won't be part of it. Thank you, and I wanted to ask you something. The books her collection, would you consider letting me borrow some of them? Not to keep, just to read. I'd like to try to understand what she saw in them, what you two talked about, all those years. The request surprised me, but it also felt like a step towards something healthier than the anger and resentment that had dominated the will reading. Of course, you're welcome to come to the house anytime. She always said the books were meant to be read, not just collected. Really? Really? I think she would have liked knowing that you wanted to reconnect with her interests. Jessica smiled. For the first time since I'd known her as an adult. Maybe you could recommend some starting points? I'm pretty out of practice with anything more challenging than magazine articles. We spent the next hour talking about books and authors, about Elvira's teaching style and her habit of connecting literature to current events. It was the longest real conversation Jessica and I had ever had, and I found myself liking her more than I'd expected. As we were getting ready to leave, she hesitated, then asked, "Do you think she was disappointed in us? In the way we all turned out?" It was a question I'd been asking myself, and I thought carefully before answering. I think she was disappointed that you all grew apart from her, but I don't think she was disappointed in who you became. She used to say that people have to find their own paths, make their own mistakes, figure out their own values. She just wished she could have been part of the journey instead of watching from a distance. Jessica nodded, wiping her eyes with a napkin. I wish that too. That evening, I called Frida to tell her about my conversation with Jessica and to ask about next steps in the estate transfer process. That's wonderful about Jessica, she said. Elvira would be pleased to know that some good might come from this difficult situation. What about Caleb? Have you heard anything about whether he's actually going to contest the will? He's hired an attorney. James Morrison from Morrison and Associates. They specialize in estate litigation. My stomach dropped. So it's really happening. It appears so. But Sylvie, I want you to understand something about will contests. They're expensive, time-consuming, and difficult to win. Caleb will have to prove either that Elvira lacked mental capacity when she made the will or that you exercised undue influence over her. Neither of those things will be easy to demonstrate, but it's possible. Anything is possible in court. But we have strong evidence in our favor. Elvira's medical records show no signs of cognitive impairment. Her journal documents her decision-making process over several years. And we have testimony from multiple people who can attest to her mental clarity and your genuine relationship with her. After we hung up, I found myself thinking about the difference between what's possible and what's likely. Even if Caleb's chances of winning were small, the process of fighting him would be emotionally draining and financially expensive. Did I want to spend the next year or two of my life defending my right to inherit something I'd never asked for? But then I thought about Elvira's letter, about her belief that I would continue the work she'd been doing. I thought about the organizations she'd supported, the scholarships she'd funded, the quiet impact she'd been making. If I gave up now, all of that would end. I also thought about the principle involved. Elvira had the right to distribute her assets as she saw fit. If I let Caleb intimidate me into walking away from the inheritance, I'd be enabling the kind of entitled thinking that had driven the wedge between Elvira and your children in the first place. I was going to fight. The next morning, I called an attorney named Rebecca Chun, whom Frida had recommended. Her office was in a converted Victorian house in the Hawthorne district, just 6 blocks from Elvira's house. She was younger than I'd expected, probably in her early 40s, with an efficiency that reminded me of Elvira herself. I've reviewed the documents Frida sent over. she said after we'd settled in her office. Your grandmother's will is clearly written and properly executed. The challenge will be defending against claims of undue influence. What exactly does that mean? Undue influence occurs when someone uses their position of trust or authority to manipulate a vulnerable person into making decisions they wouldn't normally make. In this case, Caleb will likely argue that you took advantage of your grandmother's loneliness and isolation to convince her to leave you everything. But that's not what happened. I believe you, but we'll need to prove it. We'll need to demonstrate that your relationship with Elvira was genuine and reciprocal, that she maintained her independence and decision-making capacity, and that her choice to leave you the inheritance was consistent with her values and long-term plans. Rebecca walked me through the likely timeline months of depositions, document review, and legal maneuvering before anything came to trial. The process would be expensive and emotionally difficult. I have to ask, she said. Are you sure? You want to fight this? Your uncle might be willing to settle for a significant portion of the estate. You could walk away with enough money to be comfortable for life without having to endure the stress of a trial. I thought about that option. I could probably negotiate a settlement that would give me enough to pay off my student loans, buy small house, maybe even start the nonprofit work that Elvira had been modeling. It would be easier, less confrontational, more socially acceptable, but it would also mean abandoning everything Elvira had entrusted to me. No, I said. I want to fight for all of it. Not because I want the money, but because she chose to give it to me. Honoring that choice feels like the last thing I can do for her. Rebecca smiled. Good, that's the kind of motivation that wins. Cases. Over the next few weeks, I settled into a strange new routine. I spent my mornings at the bookstore, working my shifts and trying to maintain some normalcy. Afternoons were devoted to a state business meeting with lawyers, reviewing financial documents, and learning about the various organizations Elvira had supported. Evenings I spent at Elvira's house, which was slowly starting to feel like my house. I was sleeping there most nights now, partly because it made practical sense, and partly because I found the space comforting. The house felt alive with memories and possibilities. I also started reading through Elvira's book collection more systematically, trying to understand the scope and significance of what I'd inherited. The more I learned, the more impressed I became with her curatorial skills. This wasn't just a random accumulation of books. It was a carefully chosen library that told the story of American literature, social movements, and intellectual history. There were signed first editions of major works, but also lesser-known books by marginalized authors that Elvira had rescued from obscurity. Books by women writers who had been forgotten, civil rights activists whose work had been suppressed, international authors whose perspectives had been ignored by mainstream. American culture. Each book seemed to have been chosen not just for its literary merit, but for its contribution to a larger conversation about justice, equality, and human dignity. The collection was Elvira's argument for the power of diverse voices and suppressed perspectives. I started making lists of the organizations she'd supported, trying to understand the connections between her charitable giving and her intellectual interests. She'd funded literacy programs in underserved communities, scholarships for first-generation college students, and grants for small nonprofit organizations working on social justice issues. The pattern that emerged was clear. Elvira had been using her resources to amplify voices and support causes that aligned with her belief in equality in education. The inheritance wasn't just money. It was the infrastructure for continuing that work. 3 weeks after the will reading, I got a call from Rebecca with news about Caleb's legal strategy. They filed the formal petition to contest the will. She said, "The grounds are exactly what we expected: undue influence. and questions about your grandmother's mental capacity in her final years. What happens now? Discovery phase? They'll request all of Elvira's medical records, financial documents, and correspondence. They'll want to depose you, me, Frida, and anyone else who had significant contact with her in her final years. How long will this take? Best case scenario, 6 months? More likely 8 to 12 months before we get to trial. The timeline felt overwhelming. Nearly a year of legal proceedings, testimony, and uncertainty. Nearly a year of having my relationship with Elvira scrutinized and judged by strangers. Rebecca, can I ask you something? Do you think we'll win? She was quiet for a moment. I think we have a strong case. Elvira's journal entries document her decision-making process over several years. Her medical records show no cognitive decline. Multiple witnesses can testify to her mental clarity and your genuine relationship with her. But juries are unpredictable. And families fighting over money brings out strong emotions in people. We'll need to be prepared for them to paint. You as a manipulative gold digger who took advantage of a lonely old woman. That afternoon, I was at Elvira's house cataloging books when the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I could see a woman in her 50s holding a clipboard and wearing the kind of smile that immediately put me on guard. Miss Morland? I'm Sandra Hutchins from Channel 8 News. I was wondering if I could ask you a few questions about your grandmother's will. My stomach dropped. How did you hear about that? Legal filings are public record. Our courthouse reporter flagged the story because of the unusual circumstances. A young woman inheriting a multi-million-dollar estate while the blood relatives are left out. It's the kind of human interest story our viewers find compelling. I almost laughed at the phrase human interest story. There was nothing about this situation that felt like entertainment. I'm not interested in talking to the media, I said through the door. I understand your reluctance, but the story is going to run with or without your input. Don't you want people to hear your side? There are no sides. There's just what happened. Your uncle has a very different perspective on what happened. He's been quite vocal about his concerns regarding elder abuse and financial manipulation. The words hit me like a physical blow. Caleb had been talking to reporters, spinning this story to make me look like a predator who had taken advantage of a vulnerable elderly woman. I have no comment, I said firmly. Miss Morland, your uncle alleges that you isolated your grandmother from her family and used your position of trust to influence her will. How do you respond to those accusations? I didn't respond. I walked away from the door and called Rebecca. They can't force you to talk to them, she said after I'd explained the situation. But they can run the story anyway, and without your perspective, it's likely to be one-sided. So what do I do? Nothing. For now, let me see what Caleb has been saying publicly. We might need to consider a preemptive media strategy. After we hung up, I felt like the walls of the house were closing in. This wasn't just a family dispute anymore, it was becoming a public spectacle. Strangers would be reading about my relationship, with Elvira forming opinions about my character, deciding whether I was a loving granddaughter or a calculating opportunist. That evening, I watched the Channel 8 News story online. The reporter had done exactly what she'd warned me she would do, told the story without my input. The segment was titled Family Fights, Alleged Elder Abuse, and featured an interview with Caleb standing outside his downtown office. My mother was 83 years old and had become increasingly isolated from her family. He told the camera with the kind of practiced sincerity he probably used to sell architectural services. She was vulnerable to manipulation by someone who saw an opportunity to inherit substantial assets. The reporter asked him about the specifics of his allegations. Sylvie made herself indispensable to my mother, visiting weekly and gradually, positioning herself as the primary relationship in her life. She systematically excluded other family members and created a situation where my mother became emotionally dependent on her attention and approval. Watching him describe our Tuesday afternoon tea visits as systematic manipulation made me feel nauseated. He was taking the genuine affection Elvira and I had shared and reframing it as calculated predation. The story included brief interviews with other family members. Jessica, to her credit, declined to comment. But Derek, my cousin from California, was happy to share his perspective. It's heartbreaking to think that our grandmother might have been taken advantage of during her final years, he said with what appeared to be genuine emotion. She was such a generous, trusting person. The idea that someone might have exploited those qualities for financial gain is really disturbing. The irony of Derek talking about exploitation for financial gain wasn't lost on me, even that he'd called me offering to help manage the inheritance within hours of the will reading. The story concluded with a statement from the family's attorney about their intention to contest the will and their commitment to protecting elderly people from financial abuse. I turned off my computer and sat in Elvira's living room feeling like I'd been invaded. These people were telling a story about my life, my relationship with Elvira, and my character to thousands of strangers. They were defining me as a predator and Elvira as a victim, reducing years of genuine connection to a calculated scheme. Asterisk. But the worst part was the tiny voice in my head asking whether they might be right. Had I taken advantage of Elvira's loneliness? Had I unconsciously manipulated her affection? Was I really the kind of person who would exploit an elderly woman? For financial gain, I called Cass. I saw the news story, he said, before I could even speak. What a fucking hit job. Maybe they're right, I said, voicing the doubt that had been growing stronger all evening. Maybe I did manipulate her somehow. Stop it. Right now. Stop letting them get in your head. But what if? No what ifs. You know what happened? You know why you visited her, why you cared about her, why she cared about you. Don't let a bunch of people who couldn't be bothered to have a real relationship with her convince you that yours wasn't genuine. It's going to get worse, isn't it? The media attention, the public scrutiny. Probably. But that doesn't change the facts. It just changes how many people have opinions about the facts. After we hung up, I found myself thinking about the difference between facts and narratives. The facts were simple. I had visited Elvira regularly. We had developed a close relationship. She had chosen to leave me her estate. But the narrative that Caleb was constructing around those facts was something entirely different, a story of manipulation, exploitation, and elder abuse. The power of narrative to shape perception was something Elvira had taught me through our discussions of literature and history. The same events could be told as tragedy or triumph, depending on who was doing the telling and what agenda they were serving. Caleb's narrative served his agenda of reclaiming what he felt entitled to inherit. But what was my narrative? What story was I telling about my relationship with Elvira and my right to her legacy? I went to the bookshelf and pulled out the journal where Elvira had documented her thoughts about family relationships over the years. Reading her observations about Caleb's behavior, Jessica's distance, and my own presence, I felt my certainty returning. This wasn't a story about manipulation or exploitation. This was a story about connection, attention, and the ways that love creates its own forms of inheritance. Elvira hadn't been a victim. She'd been a woman making conscious choices about how to distribute her legacy based on years of careful observation. And I wasn't a predator. I was someone who had loved her grandmother and been loved in return. That was the story I needed to tell. The next morning, I called Rebecca and told her I was ready to be more proactive about defending myself in the media. I'm glad to hear that, she said. Caleb's gotten ahead of us in terms of narrative. We need to start showing people who you really are and what your relationship with Elvira was actually like. How do we do that? Carefully. We'll start with a written statement that we can distribute to media outlets. Something that humanizes you and explains your side without saying anything that could hurt us legally. We spent the next several hours crafting a statement that told my story without falling into the legal traps that could complicate the will contest. The final version was careful but heartfelt. I am deeply saddened by the allegations being made about my relationship with my grandmother, Elvira Hawthorne. For 6 years, I visited her every Tuesday, not out of obligation or expectation, but because she was one of the most interesting, intelligent people I knew. She taught me about literature, history, and the importance of living according to your values. She listened to my dreams and fears with the kind of attention that made me feel like my thoughts mattered. I loved her, and I believe she loved me. Her decision to include me in her will was as much a surprise to me as to anyone else. I am committed to honoring her legacy and continuing the charitable work she spent her lifetime building. I hope that when this legal process is complete, people will remember Elvira not as a victim, but as a strong, independent woman who made thoughtful choices about how to use her resources to make a positive impact on the world. The statement was picked up by several news outlets, but it didn't stop the speculation and commentary. Online forums buzzed with opinions about whether I was a devoted granddaughter or a calculating gold digger. Comment sections filled with people who had never met either of us offering definitive judgments about our relationship. The attention was exhausting and invasive, but it also clarified something important for me. The court of public opinion was separate from the court of law. I couldn't control what strangers thought about me, but I could control how I responded to the legal challenge, and I was going to respond by fighting as hard as I could to protect Elvira's legacy. 6 weeks after the will reading, I received a formal notice that I was being deposed in Caleb's challenge to the will. The deposition was scheduled for the following month and would likely last several days. Rebecca spent hours preparing me for the experience, explaining how opposing counsel would try to get me to say something that could support their case. They're going to ask about every interaction you had with Elvira in her final years, she said. They'll want to know about gifts she gave you, conversations about money or inheritance, and any time she seemed confused or disoriented. She was never confused or disoriented. Good, that's important. But they'll also ask about your motivations for visiting her, your financial situation during that time, and whether you ever encouraged her to change her will or exclude other family members. The idea of having my relationship with Elvira dissected by hostile lawyers made me feel sick. How could I explain the joy of our Tuesday afternoon conversations to people who were determined to see manipulation in every interaction? Rebecca, what if I can't do this? What if I fall apart during the deposition? You won't fall apart. You'll tell the truth, and the truth is on our side. The night before the deposition, I sat in Elvira's living room surrounded by photo albums and letters, trying to prepare myself emotionally for what was coming. I looked at pictures of us together at her 80th birthday party, reading through her journal entries about our conversations, remembering the sound of her laugh when I told her stories about my disastrous dating life. These memories felt precious and private, but tomorrow they would be examined like evidence in a criminal case. Everything that had felt natural and loving would be scrutinized for signs of calculation and manipulation. But as I read through Elvira's own words about our relationship, I felt my resolve strengthening. She had documented her thought process, her observations about family dynamics, and her reasons for making the choices she made. Her voice would be heard in this process, Even though she wasn't alive to speak for herself, the deposition took place in the conference room of Morrison and Associates, a law firm that occupied the top floor of a downtown high-rise. The room was all glass and steel, designed to intimidate, and it was working. James Morrison was exactly what I'd expected, silver-haired. Expensive suit, the kind of practiced charm that probably worked well with juries. His questions started, gently establishing basic facts about my relationship with Elvira, but gradually became more pointed. Miss Morland, you testified that you visited your grandmother every Tuesday for 6 years. That's quite a commitment for someone your age. What motivated such regular visits? I enjoyed her company. She was interesting and kind, and I looked forward to our conversations. Did you ever discuss financial matters during these visits? Sometimes. She'd ask how I was managing with school and work. If I mentioned having trouble with bills, she'd sometimes offer to help. She gave you money? Small amounts sometimes. Maybe $50 or $100 if I was having a particularly hard month. Morrison made a note. How many times would you estimate she gave you money? I tried to remember. Maybe 4 or 5 times over the 6 years. Did you ever ask her for money? No, she would offer if she sensed I was struggling. How would she sense that? The question felt like a trap, but I answered honestly. I might mention that I was picking up extra shifts at work, or that I was eating a lot of ramen because it was cheap. She was perceptive about those kinds of things. So you would tell her about your financial difficulties? It would come up in conversation. She'd ask how work was going, how school was going. If I was having a hard time, she could usually tell, and then she would offer money, sometimes. Morrison paused, making more notes. Miss Morland, did your grandmother ever discuss her will with you? Not specifically. What does that mean? She never told me what was in her will, but she sometimes talked about wanting to leave a meaningful legacy, wanting her resources to support causes she cared about. Did she ever suggest that you might be included in that legacy? I thought carefully. She once said that she hoped someone would continue the work she'd been doing with literacy programs and social justice organizations. She didn't say it would be me, but I got the impression she was hoping someone in the family would be interested in that kind of work. Were you interested in that kind of work? Yes, I always admired her commitment to social justice. Had you ever expressed that admiration to her? Another trap. Yes, we talked about politics and social issues. I respected her values and activism. So you knew that expressing support for her values might influence how she felt about you? Rebecca objected before I could answer. The question assumes facts, not an evidence. Morrison rephrased. Miss Morland, were you aware that your grandmother valued social justice activism? Yes. And you shared those values? Yes. Did you ever think that sharing those values might make her more likely to include you in her will? I felt my face getting hot. No. I shared those values because they're important to me, not because I thought they would benefit me financially. The questions continued for 3 hours, covering every aspect of my relationship with Elvira. Morrison asked about her health, her mental state, her relationships with other family members, and whether I'd ever encouraged her to distance herself from her children. By the end, I felt like I'd been through a blender. Morrison had taken every loving gesture, every meaningful conversation, every moment of connection between Elvira and me, and reframed it as potential evidence of manipulation. But I'd told the truth, and the truth was that I'd loved her without agenda, visited her without expectation, and been as surprised as anyone by the inheritance. Rebecca seemed pleased with how things had gone. You did well, she said as we left the building. You were honest and consistent. and you didn't let him rattle you. It felt awful, like he was taking everything beautiful about my relationship with her and making it ugly.
That's his job!
But the deposition transcript will show that you had genuine reasons for spending time with Elvira, that she was mentally competent, and that you never actively sought to influence her will. That's what we need to prove. Over the next few months, the legal process continued its slow grind forward. Other family members were deposed. Elvira's doctors testified about her mental state. Financial experts analyzed her assets and the timeline of her will changes. The media attention gradually faded as other stories captured public interest, but the online commentary continued. I learned not to read the comments on news articles about the case because they invariably made me feel like strangers were judging me based on incomplete information and their own assumptions about family dynamics and inheritance. The hardest part was the waiting. Every day brought the possibility of new developments, new accusations, new challenges to defend against. I found myself checking my phone constantly for updates from Rebecca, living in a state of low-level anxiety that made it difficult to concentrate on anything else, but I also found unexpected sources of strength. Jessica had started visiting the house regularly, borrowing books and asking questions about Elvira's life and interests. Our conversations helped me remember why the inheritance mattered beyond the money. It was about preserving Elvira's intellectual legacy and continuing her work. Frida became a regular source of support and wisdom, sharing stories about Elvira's younger years and reminding me that fighting for what you believe in is never easy, but is always worthwhile. And Cass, my housemate and closest friend, provided the kind of unwavering loyalty that made the criticism from strangers feel less significant. 8 months after the will reading, Rebecca called with news that changed everything. "They want to settle," she said without preamble. "What does that mean?" Morrison called this morning. "They're offering to drop the will contest in exchange for a 50-50 split of the estate." I sat down hard in Elvira's kitchen chair. 50-50?
Half to me and half to Caleb.
Half to you. Half split among all the other potential heirs. Caleb would get the largest share, but Jessica, Derek, and the others would get something too. The offer was substantial, over $1 million for me, plus the house if I wanted it. I'd still be financially secure for life, still able to continue some version of Elvira's charitable work, but it would also mean abandoning half of what she'd entrusted to me. What do you think I should do?
That's not a legal question. It's a personal one.
But I will say that settlement eliminates the risk of losing everything if a jury decides they don't like you. What's the risk of that happening? Rebecca was quiet for a moment. Honestly, low but not zero. We have a strong case, but family inheritance disputes bring out strong emotions in people. Some jurors might see a young woman inheriting millions from her grandmother and decide it doesn't feel fair, regardless of the legal merits. That afternoon, I walked through the house thinking about fairness. Was it fair that Elvira had left me everything? Was it fair that she'd excluded her own children from the bulk of her estate? Was it fair that I'd inherited wealth I never worked for while other people struggled to pay their bills? But then I thought about Elvira's own sense of fairness, documented in years of journal entries and letters. She believed that fairness meant rewarding attention and care, not just blood relationships. She believed that fairness meant leaving resources to someone who would use them well, not just distributing them equally. Her version of fairness had led her to make a deliberate choice about how to distribute her legacy. Did I have the right to second-guess that choice just because it was being challenged by people who disagreed with it? I called Jessica to ask for her perspective.
"I don't know," she said honestly.
Part of me thinks 50-50 sounds reasonable, But part of me thinks Grandma Elvira knew what she was doing, and we should respect that. Would you be happy with a 50-50 settlement? I'd be happy with anything, honestly. I didn't expect to inherit money from her. But I've been thinking about what you said about her wanting someone to continue her work. If you only get half the estate, does that make it harder to do that?
It was a good question.
With half the inheritance, I'd still have substantial resources to support the causes Elvira had cared about. But I also have much less flexibility to take risks, fund new projects, or make the kind of long-term commitments that meaningful, charitable work required. That evening, I sat in Elvira's garden watching the roses she'd named after Jane Austen characters bloom in the spring twilight. Elizabeth and Jane and Catherine, still thriving despite the chaos surrounding their owner's legacy. What would Elvira want me to do? Fight to the end for every penny she'd left me, or compromise to end the conflict and preserve family relationships? I thought about the woman I'd known, principled but pragmatic, idealistic but realistic. She'd spent her life making careful decisions about when to fight and when to find another way forward. But she'd also spent her life refusing to be intimidated by people who thought they knew better than she did about how to live her life and use her resources. I called Rebecca. I'm not settling, I told her. I want to honor Elvira's choice completely, not just partially. Are you sure? This is a generous offer. They might not make another one. I'm sure. She entrusted me with her entire legacy for a reason. I'm going to fight to preserve that trust. The trial was scheduled for late October, nearly a year after Elvira's death. The weeks leading up to it felt like preparing for battle reviewing testimony, organizing evidence, anticipating the other side's arguments. Rebecca had assembled character, witnesses who could testify to Elvira's mental clarity and independence. Frida would explain their 60-year friendship and Elvira's deliberate decision-making process. Jessica would testify about her own distant relationship with Elvira and her belief that I genuinely cared for our grandmother. But the strongest evidence was Elvira's own words, her journal entries documenting her thoughts about family relationships over several years, her letters explaining her values and motivations, her clear documentation of her reasons for making the choices she'd made. On the first day of trial, the courtroom was packed with family members, reporters, and curious onlookers drawn by the story of a family fighting over millions. I sat at the plaintiff's table trying to project confidence while feeling like I might throw up. Judge Noreen Vellacourt was exactly as advertised, formidable but fair, with the kind of presence that made everyone in the room sit up straighter. She explained the legal standards for the case and reminded everyone that the burden of proof was on those challenging the will. Morrison's opening statement painted me as a calculating young woman who had systematically isolated Elvira from her family and manipulated her emotions to secure a massive inheritance. He described our Tuesday visits as part of a long-term scheme and suggested that I'd taken advantage of an elderly woman's loneliness to secure my financial future. Rebecca's opening was simpler and more direct. She described a genuine relationship between a grandmother and granddaughter who'd found in each other the kind of understanding that transcended age and circumstance. She outlined the evidence showing Elvira's mental clarity, her deliberate decision-making process, and her own explanations for the choices she'd made. The trial lasted 6 days. I testified for most of one day, answering questions about my relationship with Elvira, my motivations for visiting her, and my surprise at learning about the inheritance. Morrison tried to shake my story, but I stuck to the truth that I'd loved her, that our relationship had been genuine, and that I'd never sought to influence her will. Elvira's doctors testified that she'd shown no signs of cognitive decline or mental incapacity. Frida explained their friendship and Elvira's character. describing her as one of the most independent and strong-willed people she'd ever known. Jessica's testimony was particularly powerful as she acknowledged her own distance from Elvira and confirmed that my relationship with our grandmother had been consistently close and caring. But the most compelling evidence was Elvira's own voice, read aloud from our journals and letters. Her words painted a picture of someone who had carefully observed family dynamics for years and made deliberate choices based on those observations. Sylvie understands that attention is a form of love, that presence is a gift you can choose to give or withhold, Rebecca read from one journal entry. She's never asked me for anything, never made me feel like her visits were contingent on anything I might give her. She comes because she enjoys my company, and that makes all the difference. Morrison tried to argue that the journal entries had been influenced by my presence, that Elvira had been unconsciously shaped by my manipulation into seeing our relationship in overly positive terms. But the entries spanned several years and documented patterns of behavior and reflection that would have been impossible to orchestrate. On the final day of trial, both sides made their closing arguments. Morrison returned to his theme of elder abuse and manipulation, asking the jury to protect vulnerable elderly people from those who would take advantage of their loneliness and generosity. Rebecca focused on Elvira's autonomy and intelligence, asking the jury to respect the deliberate choices of a woman who had lived her entire life making careful decisions based on her values and observations. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, I felt like I couldn't breathe. We find in favor of the defendant. The foreman announced, "The will of Elvira Rose Hawthorne is valid and should be executed as written." The courtroom erupted in murmurs and movement. I felt tears streaming down my face, though I wasn't sure if they were from relief or grief or exhaustion. After the noise died down, Judge Velacourt addressed the courtroom with a brief statement that seemed directed as much at the family as at the legal proceedings. "This case has been about more than money," she said. "It's been about the nature of family relationships, the meaning of love and care, and the right of competent adults to make decisions about their own property. The evidence has shown that Elvira Hawthorne was a thoughtful, intelligent woman who made deliberate choices about how to distribute her assets. Those choices were based on years of observation and reflection, not on manipulation or coercion. This court will not substitute its judgment for hers." Outside the courthouse, Caleb's attorney announced that they were considering an appeal. Morrison made a statement about protecting elderly people from financial exploitation and suggested that the verdict didn't adequately address the concerns they'd raised. But inside, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't experienced in months. Elvira's choices had been validated. Her legacy would be preserved as she'd intended. Her trust in me had been legally recognized and protected. Rebecca hugged me on the courthouse steps. "You did it," she said. "You fought for her and you won." "We all won," I said, looking around at the assembled group of people who had supported me through the trial. Frida, Jessica, Cass, and even a few family members who had quietly testified on my behalf. That evening, I sat in Elvira's garden, my garden now surrounded by the roses she'd loved and the books she'd collected and the carefully preserved legacy she'd entrusted to me. The immediate crisis was over, but the real work was just beginning. I had inherited not just wealth, but responsibility. Not just assets, but a mission to continue the work Elvira had been doing quietly for decades. I had the resources now to support literacy programs, fund scholarships, and contribute to the social justice organizations she cared about. But more than that, I had inherited her template for living deliberately, for making conscious choices about how to use resources and attention to make a positive impact on the world. Over the next few months, I began the work of turning that inheritance into action. I established the Elvira Hawthorne Foundation, dedicated to supporting literacy and social justice causes. I set up scholarship programs for first generation college students and began making grants to organizations working on issues she cared about. I also opened the house for monthly literary salons, continuing the tradition of intellectual conversation and book discussion that had been so important to Elvira. The gatherings brought together people from across the community to discuss literature, ideas, and social issues, creating the kind of intergenerational dialogue that Elvira had valued. Jessica became a regular participant in these gatherings, bringing friends and colleagues who were interested in reconnecting with the kind of substantive conversation that had been missing from their lives. Our relationship deepened beyond the crisis that had brought us together, grounded now in shared appreciation for Elvira's legacy and commitment to continuing her work. Even some of the family members who had initially supported Caleb's challenge began reaching out, curious about the foundation's work and interested in finding ways to contribute to causes Elvira had supported. The inheritance dispute had forced all of us to think more carefully about what family means and how love manifests in practical actions. 6 months after the trial ended, I received a letter from Caleb. I almost threw it away without reading. But curiosity got the better of me. Sylvie, I owe you an apology. The legal challenge was driven by my anger and disappointment, not by genuine concern for my mother's welfare. I spent so many years taking her for granted that I couldn't accept the possibility that someone else had valued her more than I did. Watching the trial made me realize how little I actually knew about her interests, values, and hopes for the future. I'm not asking for forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that I recognize the injustice of what I put you through. I hope you'll use Mother's legacy well, and I believe you will. Caleb, the letter surprised me with its honesty and humility. I wrote back, thanking him for the apology and inviting him to one of the foundation's events. He never came, but the gesture felt important, an acknowledgement that the inheritance had been about more than money, and that the resolution involved more than legal victory. A year after Elvira's death, I hosted a memorial gathering in her garden. Friends, family members, and beneficiaries of her charitable giving came together to share memories and stories about her impact on their lives. Jessica read from Elvira's journals. Prita told stories about their 60-year friendship. I talked about the Tuesday afternoon conversations that had shaped my understanding of what it means to live according to your values. As the sun set over the garden she'd loved, I felt surrounded by the community she'd been quietly building for decades, people committed to literacy, social justice, and the kinds of conversations that change how we see the world. The inheritance had given me financial security and social responsibility. But it had also given me something more valuable, a clear sense of purpose and a template for how to use resources to make a meaningful impact. Standing in the garden that evening, surrounded by people whose lives had been touched by Elvira's generosity and vision, I understood finally what she'd really left me. Not just money or property, but a way of being in the world, thoughtful, generous, committed to justice, and unafraid to make choices based on love rather than obligation. The roses were blooming again, Elizabeth and Jane and Catherine thriving. In the Oregon soil, Elvira's books filled the shelves, waiting for new readers to discover their wisdom. Her legacy lived on not just in the foundation that bore her name, but in the relationships and conversations and acts of generosity that continued to grow from the seeds she planted. I was 25 years old, inheritor of a fortune and guardian of a legacy, but most importantly, I was a woman who had learned from the best teacher I'd ever known what it means to live deliberately and love without reservation. The fight for the inheritance was over. The work of honoring it had just begun. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.